So we'll, Hi there, welcome to the webinar. We're going to give folks a minute or two to enter and get settled in, and then we'll get started here in 90 seconds or so. Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm Lindsay Owens. I'm the executive director of Groundwork Collaborative, and the Groundwork team is so pleased today to be here with the team at the Institute for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University for today's webinar, the title of which is The Trump Economic Agenda, a One-Year Assessment. I'm going to give some quick opening remarks, very brief, I promise, and then we will head to our panel. But first, one piece of housekeeping. We have actually allowed time today for audience question and answer. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you, hearing your questions. At any point during today's webinar, you can use the Q&A box in the Zoom feature to put your question in the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible at the end of today's webinar. So looking forward to hearing from you. Don't be shy about asking a question. So with that, a quick introduction here. This is really a very interesting time to be evaluating the first year of the Trump administration when it comes to the economy. As many of you remember, in the first Trump administration, the economy was the president's superpower. And there has just been an incredible reversal of fortune on this front. In the first Trump administration, even as the president's approval rating slipped, his marks on the economy stayed high. There were a number of people who didn't really like the job he was doing as president, but said, hey, you got to give the guy some credit on the economy. The economy is doing really well. Today, as we hit the 1 year mark and look back on the first year of the second Trump administration, that dynamic has completely flipped. So again, Trump's approval ratings are low, but his marks on the economy are even lower. So now there is a small sliver of folks who think he's kind of an okay president, but say, actually, when it comes to the economy, he's doing a pretty lousy job. So I'm so looking forward to today's webinar because I think our panelists can shed some light on how that dynamic came to be. The economic policies the Trump administration has pursued that have led folks to be so negative on the economy, to be so frustrated with cost of living in the country, to be so frustrated with slow and slowing job growth, and more. So, really looking forward to hearing from our panelists today. And also, the panelists have agreed to talk a little bit about what the future holds and how we can dig out of this hole that we're in. So, we'll hopefully have some notes of optimism here as well. So with that, I am really pleased to hand it over to a fantastic colleague and friend of the Groundwork Collaborative, and father-in-law of a good friend of mine, Dr. Joe Stiglitz. Many of you know him. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He is the co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, and he is a university professor at Columbia. I'll hand it to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And there's so much to talk about, and we've assembled, I think, a fantastic group of people to talk about the very many different dimensions of what has happened in what might be called euphemistically a remarkable year. The As you have pointed out, uh, his economic performance is viewed widely as disappointing. And I think not only widely, I would say rightly. And we'll try to flesh out why that is. As we think about that, it's both macro, how the system has performed, uh, it's micro, it's particular, the way it's affected particular individuals. You mentioned the issue of affordability. We could have talked about, and I hope we will, about uh, inequality, um, the what was described. The big beautiful bill is often described as the most unequal, most regressive tax bill in history. Um, so, in many ways, it is not surprising that there is disappointment. I'm going to begin by talking about these issues at a very high level uh, in ways that I don't think are yet fully integrated into the public perception. So, what I'm going to talk about are things that have not yet contributed to those low ratings. And I hope other people will sort of relate this overview at a high level to the nitty-gritty of the fact that people are going to, experiencing much higher medical costs, uh, 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 problems of affordability in many dimensions, and a disappointment with the disparity between what was promised and what's been delivered. I begin by saying, at a very high level, fundamental question that economists ask, going back to Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, is what is the source of the wealth of nations? Why is it that we have a higher standard of living today than we did 250 years ago? And the answer to that is related, I believe, very strongly to the Enlightenment Project, which said that that progress was possible partly by understanding nature. To understand nature, we needed science. We also needed better ways of organizing society. It wasn't the way it was organized we inherited. We could think about things. We could invent democracy. We could invent rule of law. We could think about a whole variety of institutional arrangements by which we work together as a society. And part of that, of course, is creating truth-telling institutions, um, academics, um the press, and a whole set of other institutions, checks and balances in our society to prevent abuses of power. What we have seen in the last year has been an attack on every pillar of that Enlightenment project. And I want to emphasize how fundamental that is. It is why we are better off than we were 250 years ago. And if we attack those fundamentals, our prospects going forward are going to be weakened. I'll come back to another aspect in terms of he's made enemies around the world. We are in a new Cold War. If we're going to win that Cold War, we have to promote our capacities. And what we've done is undermine those capacities. So if I were to list among the most important negative things that has been done, It has been the attack on our universities, attack on science, cutting back on provision of science. Striking, amazing, given that our technological capacities is what has given us the comparative advantage over other countries and is why we are where we are in the world today. He's attacked the rule of law. And I think among economists, including those who were recognized for their achievements in the Nobel Prize that was given just this year, the rule of law is at the center of our economic success. And the attack on due process, and all of these affect us as individuals, human rights. When there's an attack on human rights of any individual, it's an attack on all of us. We're not talking about those broader societal consequences. We're talking about the economics here. But what I'm saying is the rule of law is absolutely essential for a well-functioning uh, uh, economy. Uh, Systems of checks and balances have been undermined. And part of the principles, two of the reasons that the rule of law and the Enlightenment principles have been so important is they reduce the scope for corruption. They move us away from the bazaar where everything is negotiated. They move us away from a world where might is right. And unfortunately, we've seen a move in the last year that has been faster in reversing the Enlightenment project than any of us could have anticipated. That has led to unprecedented levels of uncertainty going forward. There are two more aspects of this, given the limited time, I want to emphasize. Um, the first is, as all of you know, I've written a lot about globalization. One of the things that emphasized by Adam Smith as a basis of progress was globalization, trade, which allows specialization, specialization based on comparative advantage, uh, and that would raise standards of living. But for globalization to work, you need a rule of law, fairly enforced and fairly designed. And just as Trump has trampled on the principles of the rule of law within the United States, he has torn up international agreements and at the global level has effectively said, might is right. And that has undermined the ability of the US to cooperate with others. It is at the beginning of a creation of a new global architecture. The second thing I'd very briefly mention is that we had not that long ago a major financial crisis, 2008. And that financial crisis has had a long legacy. It took us a long time to recover. We haven't fully recovered in some aspects of inequality, particularly across racial lines. So that was a big event. And we learned the lesson of that as we learned the lessons of the Great Depression, not fully, but we tried to. And what we said is we need a better regulated financial system, a more transparent financial system. We've moved in the other direction. We stripped away the regulations that were adopted in the aftermath. And we've opened up a whole new arena of financial speculation and corruption through Bitcoins and a whole array of stable coins, the Genius Act. Um, I think there is serious risk of a bubble. and a bubble that will break with consequences even greater than 2008. Whether it will happen before November, like any bubble, hard to predict when and how it will break. But the fact that there is this bubble of a non-transparent financial system combined with what is almost surely an AI bubble means that I believe there's a kind of precariousness to our economy going forward. We'll see how this plays out, but what I want to emphasize is these are the long-term effects that we won't necessarily see in the months between now and November leading up to the election. But these are the kind of effects about which we ought to be really worried going forward. But I hope the rest of us will talk about some of the more immediate things, and then at the end we'll come back and try to bring the long-term vision of where we're going with the short-term consequences together, and try to bring it together with the politics. So with that, let me turn to Alex for his comments.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me here today. My name is Alex Jaquez. I'm the Chief of Policy and Advocacy with Groundwork Collaborative, and it's great to be here. Thanks for joining us. I got to say, Joe, that was pretty bleak, and I'm not sure that I have too much more in my section that is going to cheer folks up, but maybe we can get to some of the positives later in the agenda. I want to talk about two of Trump's kind of major economic policy implementations so far, what he has managed to actually achieve just in terms of size and scale, and how they're impacting inequality in the US today. One, of course, is the tax bill that Joe mentioned. In 2017, Republicans passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which at the time was one of the most drastic giveaways to the wealthy and the 1% and large corporations in the history of the United States. They made their intentions pretty clear. The tax cuts in 2017 for corporations were permanent. The tax cuts for workers were temporary. And so we were faced with a expiring tax bill at the end of 2025 and had to move to renew it. Of course, Republicans took this opportunity to further widen the gulf between those at the top and those at the bottom. And this time, I think in an even more destructive manner. The tax bill is going to cost $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years. And every year, the tax bill will reduce incomes for the bottom 10% by over $1,200, while giving away $13,000 on average to every single person in the top 1%. It is literally robbing from the poorest Americans to give to the richest Americans. And of course, much of that is on the extension of existing tax breaks, the expansion of existing tax breaks that the wealthy get to take advantage of. But I think even more draconian is the cuts that they use to partially pay for their bill at the end of the day. And those include some of the most drastic cuts to Medicaid in the history of the program, about $1 trillion. Of course, the failure to renew the Affordable Care Act subsidies and changes to the Affordable Care Act, to Medicaid, and to SNAP that are going to kick people off their health insurance and prevent people from getting food assistance. We've already started to see the damage in the Affordable Care Act premium hikes. These are going up by more than 100% on average for those in the marketplace who previously got subsidized health care. We're seeing it in Medicaid, where more than 300 rural hospitals, clinics, and nursing homes are at acute risk of closing due to the lack of guaranteed revenue from Medicaid going forward over the next decade. And we're seeing in the food assistance at a time when grocery inflation is the highest it's been in a generation. People consistently rank the cost of eating, the cost of groceries as their most important and frustrating price hike. We are taking away food assistance from millions of people, including most of those families are families with children. And so pairing that with his other sweeping policy, his trade policy, and the chaotic tariffs that we've seen him implement for every reason under the sun, for refusal to take seriously his desire to control Greenland, to retaliation for a commercial that he was not pleased with, aired by the Canadians. We've seen Trump use the threat of tariffs to go after enemies, and to create a new international system. And right now, I think what we've been seeing is that for any of his stated goals, the tariffs are not working. Manufacturing has lost jobs and productivity has slowed in the sector since the tariffs were implemented. We have not seen a significant reshoring of production and manufacturing in the US. And across the board, the chaotic and haphazard nature of how he's implemented this program has left businesses and workers frozen. We've seen businesses tell surveys like the Federal Reserve Beige Book that they are not going to hire, not put capital investment in, and not make any major decisions until they have policy certainty on what their costs are going to be going forward. And so I think this has been a major drag on business certainty, on investment, and certainly on hiring over the last year. And it's really no resolution in sight. The Supreme Court is set to rule on the president's IEEPA tariffs in the coming weeks. And no matter what happens there, if they are upheld, if they are overturned, there is going to be more confusion in the marketplace as the Trump administration hurries to either replace all of the tariffs that have gone into place and are now repealed, or move to shore up the rest of their plan, and businesses are going to be surging orders forward and trying to get all of their inventory in now that they have certain costs. So we have a macroeconomic situation that is being impacted by Trump's kind of tax and trade policies right now that Mike will get into some of the more nuanced impacts of these policies. But right now, what they're serving to do is drive up costs for those who can't afford it and give massive tax windfalls to the top 1%. It just continues to grow inequality in the US. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Alex. So let's back up about a year ago and look at what the Trump administration said that they were going to try to accomplish with their macroeconomic policy. And I think, in addition to the tax bill that Alex just laid out, they kind of made three big bets. They thought that wide and sweeping tariffs would help reindustrialize the American economy, reshoring industry, and boosting our manufacturing sector. They thought that deportations would create new job opportunities for native-born workers and basically create the ability to bring in a lot of people who are not working, in their view, which was a really huge number as it existed in 2023 and 2024. And last, through a combination of DOGE and unitary executive, the president having a lot more power over the economy, they thought they'd be able to basically close the deficit and kind of create a productivity boom by getting government out of the way, getting public sector workers into the private sector, and creating a lot of new jobs and opportunities. There's tons of quotes to this effect, and there's always a little bit. You have to take everything they say with a bit of grain of salt because it changes so much and it depends on who's saying what. This was pretty consistent across the key economic policymaking people, whether it was at Treasury, whether it was at the CEA or NEC. They were all making versions of this argument that the economy was too dependent on public sector jobs. The economy was too dependent on healthcare jobs in particular, which we'll come back to in a second. And through this mix of cuts, deportations, and tariffs, they would fundamentally transform the economy. And that's a theory. And sadly, it did not happen. It did not happen in the past year. And all the evidence says it's not going to happen in the near future. So what did happen? Manufacturing jobs are down. Blue collar jobs are down. This is across different things you can look at, whether it's manufacturing or construction or trucking and transportation. Manufacturing is down about 100,000 jobs as opposed to a year ago. There's been no boom in construction employment, in the tariffs employment in tariff affected industries. There's been no construction wave that we've expected. A lot of different ways of measuring construction, especially if you look aside from AI, were increasing over the past several years as a result of the CHIPS Act and many other things that were done as part of an industrial policy. That's all been declining in the past year, which is not surprising. Tariffs are taxes on intermediate goods. And when you tax a lot of the things that an interconnected economic unit like the United States, and especially if you do it in a haphazardous way that's changing month by month, often week by week, it's really hard for businesses to expand. It's very hard for businesses to even open. And so we've not seen the reshoring kind of miracle that the Trump administration promised. You can tell that there's a problem on their point of view because the argument now is that they didn't have a recession, that all these people predicted a recession from the tariffs or a huge inflation wave from the tariffs. And if you actually look at sober analysis, the macroeconomy, a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to predict what's going to happen over the next year. There's a lot of money to be made if you can do it well. Basically, people said growth would slow down a bit, especially once it was clear that the tariffs where they would land by like, May, growth would slow down a bit and prices would be about a half a percentage point higher, which is basically what happened. The price of goods is higher, price of food is higher, but there's no really offsetting benefit that we can see in the data so far, and I don't expect we'll see more of it. On the labor market side, it's a really slow labor market. Its hiring is at rates you would associate with a serious recession. Though there aren't layoffs, the rate at which people are finding jobs, especially people in their 20s, which I think the Trump administration was hoping to kind of consolidate as part of their new base, it's really hard for them to find a job. Their unemployment is significantly higher than you would expect given the general unemployment rate and general economic news. That's because businesses aren't hiring because of this uncertainty and this confusion. Notably, if you look at native born workers, people who would in theory benefit if the zero sum cruel world of the Trump administration's economic logic held, they're no better off. Their unemployment is higher. Their labor force participation is not better. The idea that deportations would lead to a better labor market for the people who were still remaining didn't happen because that's just not how economics works. You need a much more nuanced view about how these things intersect, and the Trump administration just simply doesn't have it. And Doge, of course, almost infamously did not cut spending or did not cut the deficit in any meaningful number, but it did cut 10% of federal workers. It did shut down major programs, and that's a huge debt it's taking on from the future, where we're going to be less innovative. We're going to have less knowledge, less regulation, less, protections that we need. The impact on the government is really severe for literally basically no savings whatsoever. And that did not create any kind of job boom. This really shouldn't surprise us. They have these contradictions built into the way that they're approaching the economy. They want to upskill the labor force and move a lot of people into manufacturing, but they want to do deportations and they want to lower the labor force. So that's very hard to do at full employment. And you need a real theory of productivity. You need a real theory of how you're getting people in off the sidelines, and they don't have it. So it doesn't surprise me that the labor force numbers do not look good and are slowing. They also want to reshore industry and become more competitive against places like China and leading industries while also gutting the administrative state, gutting the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, subsidies, and other things that we know are needed to help support industries to be competitive in this international market. And that doesn't work. And so it's not surprising to me that these kind of goals that they set for themselves, they're not meeting. I'll add two more things. Obviously the president's put a lot of pressure on the administrative state as a whole. One part of that is the Federal Reserve and which is our central bank. And there's this weird game where both the financial markets, Congress, and court are all looking at each other to see who's going to try to stop this. And occasionally one part of the government, one part of those three will step up and try to slow it down. But I do really worry the president's going to just assume control of monetary policy. And what he wants to do with it is very different than I think whether you're a dove or a hawk on inflation. The president basically wants it to control interest rates, to cover up for the tax bill that he passed and force that cost onto everyday people through inflation rather than trying to make full employment and inflation in better balance. And last, as I look to this year, all the risks are on the downside. Whether or not it's the healthcare cuts that are coming that we're going to discuss in a second, whether or not it's, maybe negative job growth as a steady state and the real impacts it's going to have on everything from construction to food. And, AI, right now, I don't think there's great evidence that AI is costing jobs, but it's accelerating. And this administration seems to have no interest or plans in how to address any of these downside risks that are facing the economy right now. And I think we're going to be poor for it.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm a professor and economist at the University of Michigan. And my area of research in economics is on healthcare. So unlike the last two panelists, I'm going to talk just about this one sector. But of course, it's a very important sector. It's 18% of GDP, and it's also a very important part of our lives. It has a big impact on people's well-being. So it has been a very active year for health policy. It obviously one of the biggest efforts from the Trump administration was through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or HR1, as Alex and Mike touched on. It's a bill that Harvard health economist David Cutler referred to recently in an article as the worst piece of healthcare legislation ever written. So his words, but I'll just describe it. I think one of the main things that it does in the health sphere, as Alex mentioned, is it drastically cuts funds to the Medicaid program, about $1 trillion in cuts over the next decade. So Medicaid, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the largest health insurer in the US. It's the in terms of covered lives, and it covers some of our most vulnerable populations. It covers kids in poor households. It covers low-income pregnant women. In some states, it covers adults living before the poverty level. And the Trump administration has really gone after it, cutting it at, again, about $1 trillion over a decade. And I think it's doing it in a way that's sort of deliberately somewhat obfuscated. The initial versions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act kind of had very direct attacks where they just took a big axe to the program. And those are, of course, very politically unpopular because even if you're not on Medicaid, many people know people who benefit from the program. So instead, it's done sort of a death by 1,000 cuts method to achieve these quote unquote cost savings. One of the ones that's talked about the most is work requirements for the ACA expansion population. So for working age adults who are on Medicaid. And you might hear that and think, oh, doesn't sound like a terrible idea. You know, let's help people get connected to the labor market. Let's help people move to economic self-sufficiency. But a problem is that we've already tried these work requirements in Medicaid. We've seen them in, for example, in Arkansas back in 2018. And what we saw and what I expect will happen with these work requirements is that they actually had no impact on people's labor supply. And what they really resulted in was a ton of administrative costs for the program that was borne largely by the state, and a lot of red tape for beneficiaries who were eligible, who were meeting these activity requirements, but who faced really high hurdles to stay and remain on the program. The CBO is predicting 10 to 11 million additional uninsured people as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I think that's quite optimistic because I think states are going to have a really hard time implementing this in a way that isn't just let's kick as many people off as possible, regardless of their efforts to fulfill these requirements. I also think there's a lot of less obvious cuts. There's changes in how states can raise revenue for the Medicaid program, and I won't happy to go into the details in the Q&A, but I won't bore you with sort of the nitty gritty of how provider taxes work. But the bottom line is there's going to be a lot less money that states have to administer this program. And that's not just going to affect the people who are subject to work requirements. That's going to affect the disabled people who are on the program, the kids who are on the program, the pregnant women who are on the program. So I think that's going to have big effects for the Medicaid beneficiaries. We know that our safety net hospitals are operating on razor-thin margins. We also know that they're required by federal law to treat people who come to their emergency departments and to their hospitals with healthcare emergencies. This is going to affect hospital revenues. There is money in the bill to support rural hospitals that some places will get, but a lot of our safety net hospitals aren't in rural areas. And I live in Southeast Michigan. I have seen a lot of hospital closures over the last 15 years that I've been here for hospitals that are serving populations, and there's nothing that kind of pops up to fill that gap. And of course, as we talk about the labor market, healthcare jobs are a big part of that, and I can see that being affected as well. And then the last thing I'll talk about briefly to try to help us get us back on schedule is obviously the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credits. The open enrollment period for the over 20 million Americans who get health insurance through the ACA exchanges just ended January 15th. And so there's a bill that's passed the House now that would extend the tax credits, but it's too late in a sense. People have gone on, and as we've heard, they've seen their premiums double. The premiums they're actually going to pay a net of tax credits double, and they've had to make those health insurance choices already. So even if we do, and it's not clear that we will, if we do this 3-year expansion of these tax credits, we have people that are looking at maybe they were paying a few $100s a month for premiums, and now they have to pay more than double. A lot of people are going to look at that and say, I need health insurance, but this is just not in the cards. So we know that expanding coverage, under the Biden administration, we saw the largest percent of our population to actually have insurance ever. And we know from a really large volume of research that there's a lot of benefits, both for the people who get the coverage and for the local communities to expanding coverage. And I think we're moving in a completely wrong direction here. So I will turn it over to Bharat with that.
Thanks. I want to also zoom out a little bit and take people back to where things were when Trump came into office. Largely Trump inherited an economy that was moving in the right direction after the global post-COVID inflation surge that we saw in 2021 and 2022. Inflation had steadily declined from a peak of about 9% in the summer of 2022 to under 3% as of Trump's inauguration. We had many, many consecutive months of robust job growth, and the unemployment rate was under 4% when Trump took office. And the Federal Reserve was in the midst of an interest rate cutting cycle and had projected many more cuts to come in 2025 because of the downward trajectory of inflation. And at the same time, we had quite robust business investment, not just in AI, which we have seen continue, but in many areas, including in new manufacturing facilities in the United States. And so then Trump came in and very quickly put elements of his economic agenda in place, and we saw the results over the second half of the year. If you recall, the quote unquote Liberation Day tariffs were announced in April. And despite their on and off nature, where some of them are increased, decreased, exempted, repealed, depending on Trump's mood, they have contributed to higher inflation and the higher cost of goods. Inflation, as I mentioned, was on a downward trajectory, and that continued in the first half of 2025. But then, after it dropped to a low of 2.3% in the summer, as the Trump agenda took hold, it pushed it back up, and now it is close to 3%. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate, which I had mentioned, had stabilized under 4% for much of the Biden administration, has now surged above 4%, and job growth overall has been sluggish, far worse than the type of job growth that we saw in 2024. And although we have a significant AI investment boom that is propping up overall numbers on investment and overall economic growth, we see investment in other areas, as Mike mentioned, tailing off, particularly in new manufacturing facilities, where we've seen a decline in investment there and a corresponding loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States as well. And that Federal Reserve, which again was projected to make a number of cuts in 2025, which would have provided a lot of relief to consumers, that those cuts have been far less than anticipated, and now, as of the meeting yesterday, have been paused. And I think we're seeing that because of higher inflation. The cuts to date have not been because the inflation trajectory has improved. It's because the job market has worsened, and so the cuts are sort of preventative to help with the unemployment rate rather than a signal that inflation has improved. So I think I want to focus on two specific areas that folks haven't covered so far. One is housing, where we see consistently across the board in voter surveys that housing costs are the top, or at least a top three concern for voters. And in the Trump administration, we have not made any progress really on housing affordability, despite a lot of noise from the administration. In fact, a number of their signature moves have increased the cost of housing. We've seen that the tariffs on imported goods, many of which are needed for new housing construction, have increased the price of building materials. And according to one analysis, could mean that we're building about 500,000 fewer new homes between now and 2030. That's about 6% of projected annual construction. That's not going to be helpful when it comes to bringing prices down. The share of households that are cost burdened on housing, in other words, are spending more than 30% of their income on rent or their mortgage payments, is as large as ever and not significantly improving. And the median single-family home price is now about 5 times the median household income, which is a ratio that is at a record high. So housing has not been an area where we've seen a lot of progress, despite a little bit of a decline in overall interest rates. And meanwhile, the administration's agenda on those items has been, I guess, scattershot would be the most generous word that I could use. There are a lot of ideas that have been suggested, then not followed through. They most recently announced that they were going to ban institutional investors from buying owner-occupied homes. If you look at the details of that, they're not actually doing that by any shape or form. It's largely governing by press release, and I think voters are starting to see that it's not translating into any outcome for them. The other area is just the Fed. We've talked a lot, and Joe talked about the sort of the rule of law and the importance of sort of a stable, predictable operating environment when it comes to long-term economic growth. And we've seen a sustained attack on the Federal Reserve by this administration, starting with the firing of a Fed board member, Lisa Cook, which was brought all the way to the Supreme Court. Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, was served with a subpoena, which he suggested was because he was not cutting interest rates as fast as the administration wanted. You have a Fed board member, Stephen Myron, who is serving on the board and pushing for much more rapid interest rate cuts while not relinquishing his role as a White House advisor, breaking down any type of independence between the White House and the Federal Reserve. All of this threatens the long-term independence of the Fed. And there's a wealth of data in economic research, academic research, historical research, looking at other countries, showing that having an independent central bank is very useful for keeping inflation contained and is connected to better long-term growth in the countries that have an independent central bank. So as Trump tries to break down that wall, again, there's potentially a short-term game for him in terms of pushing down interest rates, but the long-term consequences for the economy and the country are likely negative. So with that, I will turn it back to Joe.
Well, thank you. I think it's been an amazing discussion of what has gone wrong, and of course, there's much more that we could say. I want to comment on two things. One of them is the importance of what economists refer to as the counterfactual. The point that's been made is, yes, inflation hasn't soared, but the point is it was on the downward trend, and had it not been for his tariffs, that the presumption is that that would have continued. And the difference between where we would have been and where we are today is quite significant. And the same thing about the labor market, the same thing about investment, so that what we were on a positive trajectory, recovering from the pandemic, from the disturbances from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all of that has been brought to a halt, and things are, gone much more south than we would have hoped. I want to make one more comment, which is a number of people have mentioned the failure of the tariffs to do the fundamental thing that he wanted, which was to bring back manufacturing to the United States. And I want to link it with some of the remarks that I made earlier. Modern manufacturing is not the same as manufacturing in the 1960s, where I think Donald Trump formed his view of the world. Modern manufacturing is very science-based. Robots, engineering, and there's been a change in what we call comparative advantage, dynamic comparative advantage. China has invested enormously in engineering. And what has happened under Trump? We've attacked science. And that means there is no way that we can bring back the kind of advanced manufacturing that he hoped, unless we do more of that kind of supporting our scientific establishment, our research establishment, and he's gone, as I said, just the opposite direction. And there are many other aspects of that you have to have complex supply chains. That requires, again, kinds of investment. Investment requires a kind of a certainty of the future, and he's undermined that kind of certainty. So for me, it's not a surprise. The failures that we've seen are were in some sense predictable, uh, given what he did. I want to try to get the panel to comment on a couple of issues that where we go across what some of you talked about, and some of the things that have not been brought up. Uh, the One of the existential issues of our world today is climate change, and that was one of the things that Biden made a big effort. Um, Trump has said it's a con, it's a hoax. Uh, we were making some progress in bringing back, in uh, creating advancing the green transition. He's cut back on that. He's put U.S. in a position of a rogue country. Do any of you want to comment on what are the economic implications of that, micro, macro, of taking that kind of stance for the future of our country?
I'm happy to take a first crack at this. I worked on energy, clean energy, industrial policy, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and the White House for the last 4 years. And I think the most kind of concerning thing to me about the way the Trump administration has approached things is, of course, there are differences, I think, ideologically between Republicans and Democrats generally on the intensity, the causes, and the ramifications of climate change, as well as the kind of utility of various fuel sources, particularly coal and natural gas. But the extent to which that Trump has waged war against wind and solar energy for reasons that appear to be completely personal and ideological and not connected with the current economic reality, I think is incredibly troubling. He's canceled and tried to cancel offshore wind leases that have already been in construction and in some cases already operational. These are tens of thousands of union construction jobs. These are gigawatts of power that is flowing to the grid at a time where we're seeing the electricity load growth increase for the first time in generations due to the build out of AI data centers and other electrification efforts. We need more electricity from all sources, from many sources right now, and he's really taking several off the board, solar and wind specifically, and at the same time pouring money into uneconomical coal plants, plants that are dirtier than their counterfactuals and more expensive to run, while slashing environmental regulations across the board. I think one, this is going to result in higher energy bills for consumers, which people are already struggling with in the here and now. It's only going to increase the stress on families' budgets, and then, of course, long term, this is again a certainty and business environment question. I think it's going to be very difficult to persuade investors and capital to get into the clean energy business or really energy business at all at scale, and certainly at the scale that we're going to need to build the amount of energy we're going to need in the future to address climate change. When you don't know what the policy situation is going to be, when your permits can be revoked, when your projects can be canceled, and all of that effort and time and jobs just thrown in the trash. And so I think this is really a cutting your nose off to spite your face situation from the Trump administration. Extremely short-sighted, detrimental both to consumer finances and household budgets, but also, of course, to the long-term threat of climate change, which we know we've seen. I'm still under the snow here, and while who knows what the direct implications are of climate change in any one given storm. What we know is that it makes them worse, more intense, and more expensive over time. These are only going to bleed economic growth from the U.S., hit to GDP, and really hurt communities that are struggling.
Yeah, and let me just emphasize something that has come up a number of times already, which is the tariffs on intermediate goods make American goods more expensive, and attacking the cheapest form of energy, which is renewable, makes American goods more expensive. So both of those are hurting America's competitiveness. Do any of you other want to comment on these, either from the macro point of view or from the affordability impacts?
I just jump in and say, I think a good tell that they're in over their heads on this stuff is that the justifications for the tariffs change essentially month by month. So sometimes it's about revenue, and they're going to cancel the income tax with all the tariff revenue, which is absurd and not true. But there is substantial money here, so someone is paying something. It increasingly looks like it's definitely not other countries, and it seems like it's a mix of consumers and businesses. And as evidence and history suggests, over the next year or two, it will be primarily consumers. Sometimes it's about revenue, sometimes it's about trying to bring in foreign investment, but they also want to reduce the trade deficit, which, is at loggerheads. Sometimes it's about, trying to balance essentially trying to put pressure on other countries for both, I think, personal executive branch Trump reasons, but also to try to like force more, essentially bribes to the president in some cases, but other kinds of foreign policy things. And so it's really hard to track just what they even are trying to do with it. And if you're not pointing, tariffs are a blunt tool, they're a big tool. And you really have to know where your target is when you're trying to like do this. And if your target's constantly moving, you're going to cause a lot of damage in the intermediate process.
Yeah, one more comment. One of the things he does talk about a lot is the trade deficit. He views the trade deficit as evidence of other countries being unfair. He doesn't understand the interaction, as you mentioned, between the micro and the macro, that the trade deficit is the flip side of the fact that there's a disparity between savings, domestic savings, and domestic investment. And as Alex pointed out, the huge increase in the fiscal deficit associated with the big, beautiful bill is negative savings, and that is increasing that disparity and worsening the multilateral trade deficit. But at the micro level, uh, what he's been doing, making U.S. a less attractive place for tourism, a less attractive place for people to uh, uh, come to get educated. Uh, we are a service sector economy, and he's been shooting us in the foot in our critical service sectors. So, in many ways, we can expect a worsening of the trade deficit as a result of his policies. I want to move to a question about linking what Sarah talked about in the healthcare to the overall macroeconomic performance. Uh, Healthcare is really important and nutrition for productivity. Sarah emphasized the effect on children because a lot of the people getting Medicaid are children. Do any of you want to comment on where this is playing out on the macroeconomics, and what is the time dimension? When will we see some of these effects play out?
Well, I can hop in and just add one more thing. I mean, in my work and in other economists' research, they've looked at the effects of making investments in the health of kids and through, for example, the expansion of the Medicaid program in the 80s and 90s, and through other interventions. And there really are hugely long-term payoffs. In fact, there's a group that's put together the return on government dollars across like hundreds and hundreds of programs, and some of the most productive dollars that pay for themselves in terms of not just better health in adulthood, but better economic self-sufficiency, better, higher human capital, and ultimately paying more into the tax system as they reach their prime earning years. Some of the biggest return is on investments in low-income pregnant women, kids, infants, and so I think there are going to be sort of immediate macroeconomic effects. I mean, health is 14% of the labor market, depending on exactly how you measure it. But I think there's going to be even bigger ones in terms of just our trajectory of the workforce over the next, 5, 10, 20 years. We also know that health investments in adult, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's only kids. Those are the ones that have these really, really big long-term payoffs. But we know that health affects your productivity even in the short run. So I think there are, implications for the labor market there as well.
Yeah, maybe I should comment that putting what's going on in the context of what was going on, say, in the country in the first Trump administration, life expectancy in the United States was lower than in other advanced countries and almost any other advanced country, and was declining. And we have a burden of people who are disabled. And that obviously takes away from the productivity of our whole society. So I think that one has to see these kinds of cuts in a context of a real crisis in the United States, that we should be thinking about why is it that we have such poor health, such short life expectancy. And clearly, the response to that is not to it's to redesign our healthcare system, not to cut back on the people who need it the most. I want to move on to try to look forward. We were talking, and as I think there's a lot of long-term damage that's been done. Um, I'd like to get your reaction, and these are going to be two very broad questions, and we have limited time, so just pitch in whatever you want. Um, One of them is, how do we reverse the damage? What should be what should be the economic agenda to make sure that the damage is not as long lasting as it could be? What should we be talking about? And the second one is the messaging agenda. We have an election in November. Election is an important opportunity, if we have fair elections, to try to stop uh, these disastrous policies. Do any of you have any insight into how we craft our messages in ways that are going to be most salient to our voters?
But I guess I'm happy to go first. Look, if you for the last 3 or 4 years, the top voter concern has been affordability, and so I think there's a reason why politicians on both sides of the aisle are so focused on that. And it's interesting because, of course, with the surge in inflation in 2021 and 2022, we saw uh, you know, we saw that the sort of the cost of things became a higher level concern, things like groceries and gas. But then on top of that, you have these longer standing cost concerns about childcare and housing and the cost of higher education, which are sort of structural things in healthcare that have been going on for decades, honestly. My view is that a really narrow focus on affordability without broader context would be a mistake. And I think that there is a deeper concern that is animated in all this polling data about the basic structure of the U.S. economy, the idea that um, uh, you know the sort of pathways to a stable, not financially precarious life are being closed down. That quote unquote middle class families who on the surface are making a decent income are still having a very hard time accomplishing the things that they want to accomplish financially and still feel constrained in their ability to move to a place with better jobs, to send their kid to the type of schools that they want to send them to. And so, my hope is that we don't just talk narrowly about reversing Trump's damage, so that's very important. And that we also just don't talk narrowly about, here's our 5-point plan for alleviating the cost of housing, though that is also important. But rather, we also try to talk about a bigger view of how to make an economy that is fundamentally more fair, and that where it's not just we're going to try to grow faster and then enact new taxes to redistribute that very unfairly divided wealth, but that we have an agenda for making sure that people get more of what they help produce on the front end. And I think that the growth of AI is really going to accentuate those concerns, even if we're not seeing a lot of evidence in the data about job loss from AI now. I would expect that to accelerate in the future. If it doesn't, frankly, all of the gains, projected gains from AI are from increasing productivity. The way that you increase productivity is through the labor market. So it's kind of conditional that people's jobs are going to change if you want the productivity and economic gains from AI. But I think that that will exacerbate these feelings because, unlike previous waves of automation and technological change, this one is primarily targeting white collar jobs. And, it's not the factory floor worker that's most at risk of losing their job from AI. It's accountants and lawyers and consultants and other white collar professionals. And I think that if we are in a world, a couple of years from now where, recent college graduates who thought they were on the path for a middle class life are seeing that taken away from them because the entry level jobs are being replaced by AI. And at the same time, people mid-career, 45 and 50 years old who have, many good years left in the workforce are seeing their jobs disappear. And there's not really a pathway for them to do something else when they need income. It's going to create, I think, a big existential moment in this country about what it means to have a job and what it means to have a government that's looking out for your autonomy and control over your life. And so, anyway, that's a very long answer, but I think that the politicians that will have the most success will try to weave these ideas together and make it not just here's my 6-point plan for affordability, but here's my vision for a country where people have more autonomy and control over their lives.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bharat. I think you raised a couple of questions, issues that we haven't had time to talk about. One, and you didn't use a word I would have used, which is market power. If there is market power in, say, AI, the benefits of AI will go to Sam Altman and a few other people. If we have competition, then the benefits will be more widely spread and go to workers and to consumers. And when we use the word affordability, uh, what that means really is that incomes aren't doing very well. And that is the issue of inequality, which is really at the center of a lot of the concerns. And the big, beautiful bill made inequality worse. Well, we want to have a little time for questions from the audience. Alex, are you going to monitor those? So Alex is going to pose some questions from our participants, and let's see if we can answer those questions, keeping in mind some of the broader issues that we have in mind.
I'm going to take first at the top, moderator's privilege to take the first answer as well. So I want to go to Allison Harrington, who asked in the chat, can you talk about inequality, like what we're seeing with billionaires and trillionaire wealth growing exponentially through unfettered investment in AI? What implications does this have for long-term economic stability, not just in terms of potential for the bubble to burst, but the huge and growing gaps in wealth? So I think this is a particularly interesting question right now where many people are asking the survey results that we're getting, consumer confidence, consumer sentiment, some of the weakness in the labor market, the incredibly sour mood that the public has about the current economy, contrasted with some of the hard data that we see, particularly on spending, on actual consumer spending, of course, on the stock market and other indicators, GDP growth, et cetera. And what many economists and analysts are kind of pointing to is the emergence of what they're calling a K-shaped economy, where those at the top are really driving more and more of our economic activity, while those at the bottom continue to struggle with rising costs and lower real wages. I think this is still, I think, need to wait for some hard data to come in. But if you listen to earnings calls like we like to do at Groundwork, this is across the board. McDonald's, Dollar General, Walmart, they're all saying that their lower income customers are not showing up, and they're actually seeing middle class and upper class and wealthier individuals kind of move down the chain into their new target demographics. I think the gains that we've seen in the stock market almost entirely driven by those Mag 7 companies, by the AI companies, although there's been a bit of a pullback in recent weeks here. But What we've seen is that stock market valuations are being driven by AI investment. AI investment is being driven by these stock market valuations. There is somewhat of an incestuous cycle going on between the investment between the hyperscalers and kind of the investors here who are putting money in. All the while, the real economy seems to be struggling. And so that's something we are going to continue to watch as the top 10% of the income share makes up about 50% now, almost 50% of our consumer spending. How sustainable is it that people who have assets are going to continue to be able to drive our economy, particularly if they're not even a bubble, but even an overvaluation or a slight correction in the valuation of some of these AI companies? We're in a situation now where a pop in some of these asset and equity valuations could have real downstream impacts on the economy. Happy for anyone else to jump in on that one too.
Well, time is short. Maybe Alex, do you want to go on to the next question? Then people can make a comment on some of the other issues we've raised if they want.
Great. How long will retailers be able to eat the cost of tariffs and tariff pass through some of those forecasts that Mike was talking about earlier on some of the impacts of tariffs? How long are we going to be able to see some of this lack of pass through that we've seen lately? This is from James Reiser.
Can I amplify one aspect of that and maybe pose it maybe to Mike, who's most engaged in these issues, or Barat? It's even worse than that because the lack of confidence in the U.S. economy that others are exhibiting. Europeans are pulling their money out of the U.S. The dollar, it was supposed to strengthen normally when you impose tariffs because you import less. The dollar is weaker. A weaker dollar should also lead to more inflation. So the question is, why has there not been more inflation given the weaker dollar and given the tariffs? When will we start seeing prices go up? Mike?
So, yeah, it's a good question. So, prices have basically, so there was a pretty strong disinflationary trend from 2023 and 2024, as Bharat mentioned. Interest rates were restrictive for almost the entirety of 2024, 2023. Can argue about where rates were earlier than that at different times, but the Fed had taken action to slow economic activity. You can argue whether or not that was a necessary component of the disinflation we saw. A lot of that might have just been the supply chains and relative prices all adjusting in response to the pandemic and the reopening. But there's a real effort to bring down inflation, and that was happening. The fact that it's stopped slowing down is pretty noteworthy, and I think the reason economists don't like tariffs aren't because that they're inflationary, and it's not really because they cause recession. It's because they distort prices, they do a bunch of other things that are more long-term growth focused. So the fact that the Fed even had to spend time talking about whether or not these really large increases, historically basically unprecedented increases in tariffs, taking them back a century ago to levels we've not seen in a century, could dislodge expectations and could do all these kind of short-term macroeconomic effects that we don't normally associate with them, shows how unprecedented this was and how we're really in uncharted territory. Though we do have some sense of what's going to happen, and corporations have a lot of pricing power in this economy. The labor share of the economy is the lowest on record. You can argue whether it's been falling in the 21st century. Corporate profits measured in the national account, so as a percentage of GDP, as a percentage of national income, are at basically record highs. They increased during the pandemic as companies took on a lot of margin, perhaps because they opportunistically could, perhaps because they were anticipating all these huge price increases and wage increases that then tapered off, but they didn't taper off their margins. And so, everything about the last 25, 26 years now makes us think that corporations have a lot of power to be able to push these price increases and these taxes in the form of tariffs onto consumers and onto other people. So we'll see what ultimately happens. But I honestly, and I think many people would be kind of shocked if there wasn't much more of a pass through onto consumers over the next year.
Can I say add one more factor, which is not only do they have the power, but when there's a lot of uncertainty, they discount the future more. And that means they will take more advantage of that power because the cost of raising prices today is that you lose sales in the future. But you get the revenue today, and in the presence of greater uncertainty, the value of that revenue today is going to be higher. So there are, actually, this uncertainty itself has inflationary consequences. Alex, are there some more questions?
Yes, we got plenty. Question here. Performance of the US economy has always had an impact on the global economy, especially given the role of the US dollar, currency swap arrangements, et cetera, trade relations. How have economists in other countries reacted to US economic performance, and what kind of policies are they pursuing amidst the policy shifts just described? Basically, how are Trump's decisions reshaping the global economy right now?
Maybe I should take that because I've been engaged in talking to a lot of people in international discussions, G20, the Finance for Development meeting. Uh, Quite frankly, they aren't taking well to it. And I think Mark Carney's talk at Davos last week uh, really put together, articulated the view of people all over the world. Basically, uh, they're beginning to say we're going to have to create what I call a G minus one. We believe that cooperation is important. We believe in what economists have always talked about, that there are benefits from cooperation with other countries. And if the U.S. is not going to be among the cooperators, we'll go ahead and cooperate among ourselves. So there's just a beginning of that kind of discussion, but it is really going on, and I think Mark Carney really articulated that. There's one other aspect that maybe we should note. I talked before about the weakness of the dollar. The dollar has been at the center of the global economy for since World War II. And people are beginning to lose confidence in the dollar and lose confidence in, it's more than lose confidence. Any dependence on the United States they are afraid of can be weaponized by Trump. So if you use the dollar, he will make threats about withholding the ability to use the dollar. If you buy from the US or if you sell to the US, he will use that as a threat. So he has made it less attractive to trade with the United States. And that, of course, is going to make it, is going to hurt our competitive position in the world. So the erratic nature of his behavior makes life difficult for everybody in the world. But the fact that he has weaponized international economic interdependence in the way he has, really puts the U.S. at a marked disadvantage.
Just the one thing quickly I'd add on to that is I think what one of the consequences of this is threatening our allies, driving our trading partners, crazy with different demands and shifting goals and going back on promises, and just generally making the United States an unreliable actor on the world stage is that we are turning our ostensible allies and closest partners into the arms of other countries. And I think namely China here, where we've seen both Canada and the UK take steps to entwine themselves more closely to Beijing in recent days and weeks in ways that I think the Trump administration believes is counter to the kind of grand plan to more heavily isolate China and without the United States as a reliable trading partner, reliable partner in general. I think you're going to see more of these alliances, these trade agreements with other countries who can replace both our trading, our market, our trading capacity, and also some security as well. All right.
Well, our time is up, but let me just make just a few quick comments. It's been, as I said, a remarkable year. And I don't think there's been a year in which there's so much gone on, so much change in economic policy. What is very clear is that it has not been very well thought out, that there are so many contradictions within the policies that in so many ways we are shooting ourselves in the foot. We focused in the last in this webinar on U.S. economic policy, but as Alex's remarks just pointed out, you can't separate out our economic policy from our broader stance in the global community, our you know issues about human rights, about democracy, about our fundamental values. And in many ways, the attack that we've seen on those fundamental values has been the most corrosive. We've lost our leadership, the trust of other countries in our commitment to transparency, to fighting corruption, to democracy, to basic human rights, to the well-being of all of our citizens. So those broader impacts, I believe, will be felt in our economy. But in the last hour and 15 minutes, we've tried to focus more narrowly on the economics. And as I just want to thank all of our panelists and participants who've asked really good questions, and to say I hope this discussion will continue, particularly on the issues of how do we respond to what has happened? How do we create an agenda that really does address the fundamentals, not only correct the distortions that have happened in the last year, but really advance the basic agenda of trying to create a better economy and a better society. So thank you all.
Thank you.